Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. He never liked talking about his past. In fact, he'd always change the subject or pretend it didn't matter. He said it was boring, something he didn't want to dwell on. But I always felt there was more to it, something lurking in the shadows of his past that he wasn't telling me. Every time I brought it up, his smile would fade, and his eyes would dart away. It made me curious, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I never pressed him too hard because I loved him and didn't want to make him uncomfortable. But I couldn't help but wonder, what had he done before we met? What was so dark about his history that made him avoid it at all costs? Little did I know, one day I would discover the truth, and it would unravel everything I thought I knew about him. One rainy afternoon, I decided to clean the attic. The house had accumulated dust, and the attic was always neglected, filled with boxes we never used. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I had this sudden urge to go up there and sort through it all. As I dug through the boxes, I came across one that was tucked under old blankets and forgotten mementos. It was a small, faded cardboard box that didn't look like anything special, yet something about it caught my attention. I brushed off the dust and opened it. Inside were random papers, old letters, photos of a younger version of him, and some receipts. But it was something else that grabbed my attention, a yellowed newspaper article. I pulled it out cautiously, feeling a strange sense of foreboding. The headline was bold and sharp, almost too bold for an article that had clearly aged over time. It read, "Man arrested for fraud." I froze. My heart raced as I stared at the photo accompanying the article. The man in the picture looked exactly like my husband. His features, his eyes, his smile. I turned the article over, scanning the details. The name beneath the headline was unfamiliar to me, Daniel Crow. That was not the name my husband had given me. But there was no mistaking it. This was his face. Was it some kind of coincidence? Or was it possible that the man I had married was someone else entirely? A part of me wanted to brush it off as just a strange resemblance. But the more I looked, the more questions it raised. Was it really him? And if it was, why had he kept this secret from me all these years? I couldn't believe it, but the evidence was right in front of me. This man in the photo, it was undeniably my husband. The same dark eyes, the same jawline, the same wisp of a smile that always made him look so charming. I felt the room spin as my thoughts raced. How could he have been arrested for fraud? What did he do? Was he guilty? And why hadn't he ever mentioned this to me? I tried to calm myself. Maybe it wasn't him. After all, the name wasn't the same. But then again, he could have easily changed it, couldn't he? People do that all the time when they want to start fresh. But why would he want to hide his past from me? I looked at the photo again, feeling a lump form in my throat. This wasn't just a story from a distant past. It was part of his life, a life he'd chosen to keep hidden from me. But why? My hands were shaking as I set the article down on the coffee table. I kept glancing at it, the image of him staring back at me. I couldn't get the question out of my mind. What was he hiding? I felt a mixture of anger, confusion, and fear. How could he look me in the eyes every day, smile, and pretend everything was fine when there was this dark secret in his past? And more importantly, why hadn't he told me about it? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to know the truth. I couldn't just let this go. The man I had married, the person I trusted with my life, might not even be who I thought he was. I needed answers. I needed to confront him. But I had to be careful. If he really was hiding something, I had no idea how he'd react. But deep down, I knew I couldn't live with this mystery hanging over me any longer. The moment he walked through the door, I knew something had changed. His usual calm demeanor seemed off, as if he could sense I had found something. I tried to act normal, but my heart was racing. I casually picked up the newspaper article and set it in front of him. His eyes immediately flicked to it, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. For a brief moment, he looked like he was going to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he stood there, frozen, as if he had been caught in the act. I took a deep breath, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who is Daniel Crow?" He blinked, his face slowly losing its color. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but I could see it in his eyes. He was lying. The man in the article was him. The man I loved and trusted had a past full of secrets, and now I was standing at the edge of discovering everything. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my head spinning with disbelief. "You don't know what I'm talking about?" I repeated, my voice cold now. "This man looks exactly like you. The same face, the same eyes." I watched him closely, searching for any sign of guilt, but he just looked back at me, his face masked with a mixture of surprise and discomfort. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice breaking. "It was a long time ago." My heart sank. A long time ago? That wasn't enough. His vague words only deepened the hole of doubt that was opening between us. I needed to know what really happened. Was he lying about his past to protect me? Or was there something far darker lurking behind his secrecy? His sudden shift in tone, like he was about to confess, made me think the latter. But what was I about to hear? I was terrified of the truth. I needed answers, but I didn't want to push him too hard. I loved him, and this was all too much to process in one go. The shock of finding out the man I married might not be who he said he was too overwhelming. But I couldn't shake the image of that article from my mind. I spent the next few days in a daze, wondering whether I should confront him again or give him space. But the fear that he was hiding something too big to ignore kept me awake at night. I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining the worst. What if he was still involved in something criminal? What if his past was even darker than I could have ever imagined? The questions piled up, each one more pressing than the last. I decided that I couldn't just let it go. I would find the answers, no matter what. I took matters into my own hands. I started searching online for any trace of Daniel Crowe, hoping to find more information, but it felt like chasing a ghost. There were only vague mentions of his name in old news archives, none of them offering any new details. I couldn't stop thinking about what that might mean. Was it all just a mistake? Or was my husband truly hiding something from me? One afternoon, I decided to drive to the local library, thinking that perhaps I could uncover more in the dusty old archives. After hours of searching, I found a lead. A woman named Lucy had been interviewed in the article about the fraud case. She was one of the only people listed in connection to the crime. I quickly wrote down her name, hoping she could shed some light on what had really happened. This was getting more complicated by the minute, but I was determined to find out the truth. The next morning, I decided to take a bold step and reach out to Lucy. I found her contact information and nervously dialed her number. She answered on the third ring, her voice soft but cautious. "Hello?" she asked, as if unsure who was on the other end. "Is this Lucy? The one from the article about Daniel Crowe?" I asked, my heart racing. There was a pause on the other end. Then, she sighed. "Yes, it's me. Why do you want to know?" Her tone was wary, like she was protecting herself from something or someone. I'm married to a man who looks exactly like the person in the article. His name is different, but he's been hiding his past from me." The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like an eternity before she spoke again, her voice low. "You need to be careful," she warned. "That man's past isn't something you can ignore. Trust me on that." Lucy's warning hung in the air, its weight sinking deep into my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What's going on? What does he have to do with all this?" There was a long pause before she finally spoke again, as though weighing every word. Daniel Crowe was not just a man involved in a fraudulent scheme. He was the mastermind behind it, a man who knew how to manipulate people into doing his bidding. He ruined lives, left families bankrupt, and then disappeared without a trace. I could barely breathe. "You're saying my husband? He's the same person? Is he still involved in this?" Lucy didn't answer immediately. Instead, I heard her take a deep breath. "I don't know where he is now, but be careful. He's dangerous, and he'll do whatever it takes to keep his secrets buried." The line went dead. My heart raced as the room seemed to spin. Was I really married to someone like that? I couldn't breathe. The truth was far worse than I'd ever imagined. My husband was involved in a crime. No, not just involved, but the person responsible for the scheme that had wrecked so many lives. My mind raced, trying to process everything. Had he really changed? Could he be the same person I had fallen in love with? The man who promised me everything? And if he could so easily lie to me about his past, what else had he been hiding? I sat down, the weight of the conversation with Lucy pressing on my chest. The life I thought I knew, the life I thought I had built, was beginning to unravel. I had to know the full truth. I had to confront him once and for all. But as the minutes ticked by, I began to wonder if I was prepared to hear the truth, no matter how ugly it was. Could I forgive him? Was it even possible to trust him again? I couldn't put it off any longer. I needed answers, and I needed them now. When he came home that evening, I was waiting for him. The tension in the room was palpable, thick and suffocating. He looked at me, his eyes flicking nervously between the door and me. I didn't waste any time. I spoke to Lucy, I said, my voice tight with anger. She told me everything, about you, about the fraud, about the lives you ruined. You can't hide from this anymore. His face turned pale, and his lips trembled as he opened his mouth to speak. But nothing came out. You lied to me, I continued, my voice rising. You've been lying to me all this time. Who are you really? Why did you keep all of this from me? The silence between us was deafening. I had never seen him so vulnerable, so exposed. The man who had always been so confident, so assured, was now standing before me, unable to even speak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice hoarse. I didn't want you to know. I was ashamed of who I used to be. I thought if I could just leave it all behind, start fresh, maybe I could escape the mistakes I made. But I never could. His words were heavy, filled with regret. I was involved in something terrible, something I can never undo. I was the one who started the scheme. I was the one who ruined those people's lives. But I swear to you, I'm not that man anymore. His eyes searched mine, pleading for understanding. I made mistakes, but I'm not the same person I was then. I wanted to protect you, to keep you from the truth because I thought if you knew, you would leave me. I thought you could never love someone like me. His confession hung in the air, and I struggled to process it. Was he telling the truth? Could I believe him? I wanted to believe him. I wanted to hold on to the man I had married, the one who had promised to love and protect me. But the words Lucy had said kept echoing in my mind. He's dangerous. My hands shook as I placed them in my lap, trying to steady myself. How do I know you're not still hiding something? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How can I ever trust you again after everything? He reached out for my hand, his touch gentle but desperate. I can't change the past, but I can change my future. I've spent years trying to make amends, trying to live an honest life. But I know it's not enough to erase what I've done. He paused, his eyes searching mine. I can't ask you to forgive me. I can't ask you to forget. But I'm asking you to believe that I'm not that man anymore. Please, don't leave me. His words lingered in the air, thick with emotion. I looked at him, my heart torn between the man I thought I knew and the stranger standing before me. Could I really believe him? Could I truly accept that he was no longer the man from that article, the one whose actions had devastated so many lives? I pulled my hand away from his, needing space to think. My mind was racing, but my heart was conflicted. Part of me wanted to forgive him, wanted to believe that people could change. But another part of me was terrified that I had been deceived all along. I don't know if I can believe you, I whispered, my voice trembling. How can I ever trust you again? You kept this from me for so long. He dropped his head, as if the weight of my words was too much to bear. I know I've hurt you, he said quietly, but I need you to understand. I never wanted to lose you. I've just been so afraid of what you'd think if you knew the truth. The silence that followed his admission felt like it stretched on forever. I could see the regret in his eyes, the genuine remorse, but I wasn't sure if that was enough. If you're truly sorry, I said, struggling to keep my emotions in check, then what are you going to do about it? How are you going to prove that you've changed? He seemed to hesitate, as if searching for the right words. I've already started. I'm involved in community programs now, working to help the people I hurt, he explained. I know it won't fix everything, but it's a start. I'm trying to make things right. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, the weight of his past clearly bearing down on him. I can't erase what I've done, but I can work every day to prove that I'm not that person anymore. Please, give me a chance to show you. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that he was telling the truth. But my fear and my doubts held me back. The next few days were a blur. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to give him a chance, to believe that he was truly a changed man. But the other part of me was filled with fear that I was making a mistake. I kept thinking about the lives that had been destroyed by the fraud, about the people who had lost everything because of his actions. How could I ignore that? How could I possibly move forward with him, knowing what he had done? But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the love I felt for him. I couldn't erase the memories of the man I had married, the man who had made me feel safe and loved. I needed time to think, time to process everything. But how much time did I really have? My heart and my mind were at war, and I wasn't sure which side would win. I decided to take some time for myself. I needed space to clear my head and figure out what I wanted. I took a walk through the park, the cool air helping to calm my racing thoughts. The sound of children playing, couples talking, and leaves rustling in the wind made me feel a sense of normalcy, something I hadn't felt in days. I sat on a bench, watching the world go by, and tried to imagine a life without him. Could I really walk away from everything we had? Could I leave behind the man I had loved for so many years? The thought of it made my chest tighten. But at the same time, the idea of staying with him, of continuing a life built on lies, felt equally unbearable. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, and made a silent promise to myself. I would find a way to make the right decision, even if it meant facing some uncomfortable truths along the way. As I returned home that evening, I found him waiting for me. His face was full of concern, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he simply reached out and pulled me into a hug. I held on to him for a moment, but then pulled away, needing to speak the words I had been holding inside. I've been thinking, I began, my voice steady but filled with uncertainty. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I can't ignore what I still feel for you. I need to know, once and for all, that you are who you say you are now. I can't live in the shadow of your past anymore. I need you to prove to me that you've changed. His eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm worthy of your trust. His words were sincere, and I wanted to believe him. But deep down, I knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. The road to healing and forgiveness was long, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to walk it. The days that followed were filled with moments of uncertainty. We tried to move forward, but the weight of his past hung over us like a dark cloud, threatening to ruin any chance of normalcy. He kept his word, attending counseling sessions, volunteering at a shelter for people affected by financial fraud, and doing everything he could to prove his commitment to change. But every time I looked at him, I couldn't shake the image of that newspaper article, the man who had ruined so many lives, the man who had lied to me for years. It was like living with a ghost, a constant reminder of the person he used to be. I could see his struggle, his remorse, but it wasn't enough to silence the doubts that gnawed at me. I tried to push them away, to focus on the progress he was making, but I felt like I was drowning in a sea of uncertainty. One evening, after a particularly emotional therapy session, he came home looking exhausted. "I'm doing everything I can," he said, his voice raw with frustration. "I don't know how much more I can prove to you." I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll this was taking on him. But as much as I wanted to believe in his redemption, I couldn't ignore the voice in my head that told me I was making a mistake. "I don't know if it's enough," I admitted, my heart heavy with the weight of my words. "I want to believe you. I really do. But I don't know how to move past what you did." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident on his face. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't lose you. I've already lost so much, and I'm trying to do the right thing. Please, don't give up on me." I stayed awake that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Was I being too harsh? Was I expecting too much too soon? He was trying, after all. But was it enough? Could a person really change that much? Or was I just fooling myself into believing in a version of him that didn't exist? My thoughts kept swirling, and the uncertainty grew with each passing hour. I thought about everything: the life we had built together, the love we had shared, and the promises we had made. But then I thought about the people he had hurt, the lies he had told. How could I ever look at him the same way again? I wasn't sure if I could forgive him, but I didn't know if I could walk away either. The next morning, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of pushing him away, I would face my fears head-on. I needed to understand everything, the full extent of his past, the truth about who he really was, and how deep the deception went. I needed to hear it all, even if it broke me. So, I sat down with him over breakfast, the silence between us heavy. "I need you to tell me everything," I said, my voice steady. "I need to know what you've done, all of it. No more lies, no more secrets. I can't keep living like this." He looked at me, a mixture of fear and relief crossing his face. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. "Once you hear it all, there's no going back." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I need the truth. I can't move forward without it." He took a deep breath and began to speak. He started from the beginning, recounting everything: the fraudulent scheme, the people he had manipulated, the lives he had ruined. He told me about the fear he had felt when it all came crashing down, about the years he had spent hiding, trying to outrun his past. He spoke of his regrets, his guilt, and the toll it had taken on him. And as he spoke, I felt my world shifting. The man I thought I knew, the man I had married, seemed so distant now. The person sitting in front of me was filled with remorse, yes, but he was also someone I didn't recognize. He had done terrible things, things I could never fully understand. But as he spoke, I could see the pain in his eyes, the vulnerability. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, but for a chance to make things right. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I've done things I can never undo, but I swear to you, I'm trying to be better." I sat there, listening to him, but my mind was spinning. The weight of his confession was unbearable, and yet, a part of me couldn't help but feel sympathy for him. He had made mistakes, massive ones, but he was remorseful. He was trying. Could that be enough? Could I really forgive him, knowing the full extent of his past? I wasn't sure. But in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just angry at him. I was angry at myself for letting my love blind me to the truth for so long. I had ignored the warning signs, convinced myself that everything was fine. But the truth was, I had been living in a fantasy. "I don't know what to do with all of this," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached for my hand, his grip tight, as if holding on to me was the only thing keeping him grounded. "I'll wait as long as you need," he said quietly. "I won't rush you, but I'll never give up on us." The days that followed felt like a blur. I went through the motions, but my mind was never fully present. I kept replaying everything he had told me, every word, every detail. And with each passing day, the truth became harder to ignore. He had been living a double life, one that I had never suspected. He had lied to me for years, hidden his past, and only now was he opening up to me. It was like being trapped in a never-ending spiral, where every new revelation made it harder to see a way out. I was torn between wanting to believe that he could change and fearing that I was simply setting myself up for more heartbreak. "How can I ever trust you again?" I asked one night, my voice breaking as I looked at him. He didn't have an answer. He didn't need one. He knew that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. As the weeks passed, I tried to focus on my own healing. I began seeing a therapist, someone I could talk to about everything that had happened. She helped me unpack my feelings, helped me understand that what I was experiencing was normal, given the circumstances. I wasn't weak for being confused. I wasn't wrong for questioning everything. But the more I talked, the more I realized that I was still holding on to something. Something that had once been beautiful, something that I didn't want to let go of. Despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal, I still loved him. But love wasn't enough. Not when trust had been shattered so completely. And so, I found myself at a crossroads, torn between the man I had loved and the reality of who he really was. One night, after weeks of silence and reflection, I decided I needed answers, not just from him, but from myself. I sat down with him and asked the question I had been avoiding. "What do you want from me? What are you asking for?" He looked at me, his eyes full of pain, as if he had already accepted the possibility that I might walk away. I want to be with you, he said simply. But more than that, I want to prove to you that I can be a better man. I want to make amends, not just for what I did to you, but for everything I've done in my life. But if you can't find it in your heart to forgive me, then I'll understand. I won't force you to stay. His words were heartbreaking, but they also gave me clarity. He wasn't asking for unconditional forgiveness. He was asking for a chance, and he was prepared for the possibility that it might never come. And in that moment, I realized something. I had spent so long wondering if I could forgive him, but I hadn't asked myself if I was ready to forgive myself for staying so long in the dark. It had been months since I found that article, months since everything had come crashing down. I had thought about leaving, about walking away from him and everything we had built. But every time I tried to picture a life without him, it felt like losing a part of myself. He had been my everything, my partner, my confidant, the man I had loved so deeply, the man I thought I knew. I realized then that love was messy, it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy. But maybe it wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing to move forward. I wasn't ready to forgive him yet, but I wasn't ready to walk away either. I needed time, more time to heal, to decide if he could truly change. But the one thing I was sure of was that I couldn't do it alone. So, I made a decision. I would stay, but only if we could keep working on ourselves together. We had both made mistakes, but perhaps there was still hope for us, if we were both willing to fight for it. The decision to stay wasn't an easy one, but it felt like the right choice for now. I wanted to believe in the possibility of change, and more than anything, I needed to see him fight for us. We both agreed to take things slow, to rebuild the foundation of our relationship. It wasn't going to happen overnight, and I knew that. But there was a part of me that still wanted to give us a chance, despite the pain and confusion I felt. Slowly, we started to reintroduce small moments of connection, conversations about things other than the past, walks in the park, and even cooking together. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was progress. I had to remind myself that healing took time, and that trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt brick by brick. But there were moments when I caught myself questioning if I was doing the right thing. Was I holding on to a memory of what we used to be, or was I truly willing to face the reality of who we were now? One evening, as we sat on the couch, quietly watching a movie, I looked at him and saw the man I had once fallen in love with, the man I thought I had lost forever. He had changed. I could see it in the way he treated me, the way he tried to make things right, the way he worked tirelessly to earn back my trust. I had to admit that he was doing everything he could. But then, the nagging voice in the back of my mind would remind me of the lies, of the betrayal, of the things he had hidden from me for so long. Was I being too naive? Was I allowing myself to believe in a fairy tale when I should be facing the harsh truth? I couldn't answer that question yet, but I knew one thing. I couldn't move forward without addressing my own doubts. So, I decided to face them head-on. I scheduled another therapy session, this time to talk about my own fears and uncertainties. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me and what I needed in order to heal. Therapy opened my eyes to something I hadn't fully acknowledged before, the extent to which I had been suppressing my own feelings. I had been so focused on trying to help him fix his past that I had neglected my own emotional needs. I had allowed myself to be consumed by the desire to make things work, to give him a chance to redeem himself, that I had forgotten to take care of myself. I hadn't allowed myself to grieve the loss of the man I thought I had married, the idealized version of him that had shattered. As I talked through my feelings, I realized that healing wasn't just about forgiving him. It was about allowing myself to feel everything I had been avoiding. The anger, the sadness, the betrayal. Those emotions needed to be acknowledged and processed before I could truly move forward. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was taking control of my own healing. In the weeks that followed, I began to focus more on myself. I spent time doing things I had neglected, pursuing hobbies, reconnecting with old friends, and allowing myself moments of joy outside of our relationship. It felt good to reclaim a part of my life that had been put on hold. At the same time, he continued to put in the work. He attended therapy on his own, worked on rebuilding trust, and took responsibility for the things he had done. We communicated more openly than we had in years, but even with all the progress, there were still days when I questioned everything. Could I really forgive him? Could I truly accept him for who he was now, with all his flaws and mistakes? The answer was elusive, and I knew it would take time to find it. But one thing became clear. I was learning to live with uncertainty. I was no longer waiting for some perfect resolution. I was learning to embrace the journey, no matter where it led. One evening, after a particularly heartfelt conversation, he looked at me and asked, "Do you think we can get past this? Do you think we can ever be happy again?" His question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I could see the hope in his eyes, the desperation for reassurance. I wanted to believe that we could find a way forward, but the truth was, I didn't know. What I did know was that we had both been through so much, and despite everything, we were still here, still fighting. And that counted for something. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see where this journey takes us." He nodded, his face filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. We didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. The weeks blurred together. We moved through our days with cautious optimism, unsure but determined. The space between us had shrunk, but so had the distance between the man I had married and the man he was trying to become. I watched him, noticing the small changes. He was more present, more attentive, more patient. But there were moments, quiet ones, when his past would catch up with him. The weight of the lies, the secrets, it lingered, like an invisible shadow. We tried to talk about it, but the words never came out right. I wanted him to explain himself more, to give me every detail, but I knew I couldn't ask for too much. At least not yet. I had to let him process things in his own way. I often wondered if I was holding on to something that wasn't worth saving. Was I just clinging to a version of him that no longer existed? Or was I witnessing a man who was truly trying to change? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I didn't want to push him away. Not again. One night, I found myself alone, sitting in front of the mirror. I stared at my reflection, wondering who I was becoming. I had spent so much time focusing on him, on fixing what was broken, that I had lost sight of who I was. It was strange. I'd always been so independent, so sure of myself. But now, I felt like I was waiting for something to change, something external to validate my own worth. I had always believed that love should be enough, but the truth was, love alone couldn't heal all wounds. I had to heal myself too. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about me, and whether I could find peace in my own heart. I had always been afraid of being alone, of facing the unknown without someone by my side. But maybe, just maybe, this journey wasn't just about us. It was about me rediscovering who I was outside of this relationship. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I had changed over the past months. The woman I had been before this all started was still in there, somewhere, beneath the layers of confusion and heartache. I had forgotten what it felt like to live for myself, to pursue my own dreams and passions without worrying about anyone else. That night, I signed up for a painting class. It felt like a small step, but it was a step toward reclaiming myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to excitement. It wasn't about escaping my reality. It was about creating a space where I could exist outside of all the drama and pain. I needed something to remind me that I was still capable of joy, of living fully, even if things with him weren't perfect. It was a new beginning, not just for our relationship, but for me. I didn't tell him about the class right away. It wasn't that I didn't want him to know, but I wanted it to be my thing, something for me. The next few weeks were a mix of quiet progress and unsettling questions. He continued his therapy, and we tried to have more honest conversations, but I still felt like something was missing. I wasn't sure if it was him, or me, or us, but it was like there was an unspoken divide that neither of us could cross. I didn't want to ask too much of him, and I didn't want to reveal my uncertainties, afraid of pushing him away. But on a particularly hard day, I found myself opening up, letting my guard down for the first time in weeks. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm staying because I want to, or because I'm afraid to be alone." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw vulnerability in his eyes. "I'm not perfect," he said softly, "but I'm trying, and I'll keep trying. If you decide to leave, I'll understand. But please know that I'll never stop loving you." His words echoed in my mind long after that conversation. I spent days turning them over, trying to decipher what they meant for me, for us. Was he giving me an out? Was he telling me that he had accepted the possibility of losing me? Or was he simply acknowledging the depth of the situation, the uncertainty that hung between us? I didn't know, but I realized something important. I had to make a choice. I couldn't keep living in limbo, constantly waiting for something to change. It wasn't fair to either of us. And so, I took a deep breath and made the hardest decision I had ever made. I would give him one last chance, not because I felt obligated, but because I still believed in us. I still believed in the love we had shared, even if it was broken and imperfect. "Let's keep trying," I said quietly, looking at him. His face softened, and I saw relief mixed with the remnants of pain. "Thank you," he whispered. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, we were both ready to face the future, together or apart. As we moved forward, it wasn't like flipping a switch. There were days filled with laughter, where things felt almost normal. Then there were days when the weight of our past would creep in, uninvited, casting shadows over our fragile peace. We learned to navigate those moments with more grace. No explosive fights, just quiet acknowledgments of the hurt lingering beneath the surface. I noticed he listened more, not just with his ears, but with his heart. And I started to feel seen, really seen. Not as a woman caught in his past mistakes, but as someone worthy of love without conditions. Yet, a small voice inside me kept asking, was this enough? I found solace in my painting class. Each brushstroke felt like a silent rebellion against the chaos of my emotions. I painted not for perfection, but for release, for clarity. One evening, as I packed up my supplies, I realized how freeing it felt to have something that belonged solely to me. No shared history, no complicated emotions, just colors and canvas. When I got home, he noticed the paint smudges on my fingers. "What's this?" he asked with a smile. I hesitated, then confessed about the class. His reaction surprised me. He wasn't hurt or distant. Instead, he said, "I'm glad you have something for yourself." It was simple, but it meant everything. The more I embraced my independence, the more our relationship shifted. We weren't tangled in the same old patterns anymore. We gave each other space, but we also found new ways to reconnect. One night, as we sat on the balcony under the stars, he said, "I never realized how much I was holding you back." I looked at him, feeling both sadness and gratitude. "Maybe we both held ourselves back," I replied softly. That night, we talked for hours, not about the past, but about our dreams, fears, and everything in between. It felt like meeting each other for the first time, stripped of pretense and weighted history. Despite the progress, there were still unanswered questions lurking in the corners of my mind. One afternoon, while organizing old boxes, I stumbled upon the newspaper article again. The yellowed pages, the headline, it all came rushing back. I sat there, holding it, wondering if I truly knew the man I loved. When he came home, I showed it to him, my heart racing. He sat beside me, his expression unreadable. "Do you regret it?" I asked quietly. He stared at the article, then at me. "I regret hurting people, but if I hadn't been that man, I wouldn't have met you. My mistakes shaped me, but they don't define me anymore." His honesty, raw and unpolished, hit me harder than any lie ever could. From that day on, we made a pact, no more avoiding the past. We'd face it, together, no matter how uncomfortable. We shared stories, both good and bad. I learned about his childhood, the mistakes that spiraled into worse decisions, and the guilt he carried silently. In turn, I shared my fears, of abandonment, of not being enough, of loving someone who could break me. It was messy and emotional, but it was real. For the first time, I wasn't afraid to see him for who he truly was. And in doing so, I discovered parts of myself I had long buried. We weren't perfect, but we were honest. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. With each conversation, layers of fear peeled away. We weren't two people hiding behind facades anymore. We were raw, exposed, and surprisingly closer because of it. One rainy afternoon, he surprised me with a small notebook. Inside, he'd written letters, dozens of them. Letters he'd written over the years but never sent, filled with regrets, hopes, and confessions. I spent hours reading, tears blurring the ink. Each word painted a picture of a man haunted by his past but desperately wanting to be better. When I finished, I looked at him, overwhelmed. "This is the real you," I whispered, and for the first time, I felt like I truly knew him. As time passed, our love evolved. It wasn't the naive, fairy tale kind. It was something deeper, forged through fire and honesty. We built new traditions, simple things like Sunday morning walks, cooking dinner together, or leaving notes in unexpected places. It wasn't about grand gestures anymore. It was the small, everyday moments that mattered. One evening, as we watched the sunset, he held my hand and said, "I don't deserve you." I squeezed his hand gently. Maybe we don't deserve each other. Maybe we just choose each other, every day. And that's what love became for us. A choice, not bound by perfection, but strengthened by acceptance. There were still moments when doubt crept in, quiet, fleeting thoughts whispering, "What if it all falls apart again?" But instead of letting fear dictate my actions, I spoke those worries aloud. And he listened, not to fix things, but simply to understand. One evening, I confessed, "Sometimes I'm scared that one day you'll disappear, like it was all temporary." He didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he looked me in the eyes and said, "I can't promise perfection, but I promise to show up, even when it's hard." Those words, simple yet profound, anchored me more than any grand declaration ever could. Years later, as I sat on our porch, watching him read in the fading light, I thought about the journey we'd taken. The lies, the truths, the heartbreak, and healing. It was all part of our story. A messy, imperfect, beautiful story. I realized that love isn't about finding someone without flaws. It's about finding someone whose flaws you're willing to face, together. I turned to him, feeling a surge of gratitude. "We've come a long way," I whispered. He smiled, lines of time etched around his eyes. "And I'd choose this journey with you every single time." Looking back, I don't see just the pain or the betrayal. I see growth, resilience, and a love that refused to be defined by mistakes. If I'd never found that newspaper article, maybe I would have lived in blissful ignorance. But I wouldn't trade the truth for anything. It made us real. It made me real. And now, as I share this story, I realize it's not just about uncovering his past. It's about discovering my own strength, my capacity to forgive, and the depth of love I never thought possible. Life isn't about avoiding the cracks. It's about finding beauty in the way the light shines through them.